So, welcome to the end of our conference. My name is Thomas Purifoy. I don't think I got a chance to meet every one of you that was here, but I just want to say thank you for coming. It was a real privilege to have you here in Dixon, Tennessee, here at Freed-Hardeman University. These guys were great. It's a great facility, and it was a really nice time. I personally know that every time I walked into a lecture, I was always amazed at what I learned. I mean, every time I came in, these scientists and the scholars that were there were just digging down. And I think, as I mentioned, listening even to Doug Petrovich, who we interviewed at, the Oriental Institute, and I thought we went to a long interview, but he tripled what we did here. So, and I think that was the case for every one of the scientists. So it was just, again, I hope that y'all enjoyed it and learned a lot. I wanted to say just three things, though, in closing, kind of to sum this thing up at the end. And the first thing I wanted to say is, a lot of this started with us starting to make a film. And it started 3 years ago in terms of, for this conference. Now, creationism has been going on a long time. And many of the folks who've spoken here have been doing this for decades. And many of them have tough skin. They've had to go through a lot to kind of persist in an environment, and then in many places would say, we are not interested in what you have to say about Genesis. So I think in many ways what the film was kind of a testimony to the work of these scientists and scholars. And so in one way, what we wanted to do was to let them speak for themselves. And so although it was just 5 to 10 minutes for each of them in a film, that's all the documentary film really enables you to do. What we wanted to do, though, is let them present the positive case for creation. And I think that's important. There's a lot of folks that talk about, anti-evolution, evolution can't be right, that, we know that this can't be true. And there's a place for that, and I think it's important. But I think that, as I think my friend Marcus Ross said, is that unless you provide someone a better place to go, even if they're living at a shack in the middle of the woods and you making fun of the shack doesn't do any good. You got to be able to point to that there's a better place to go live. And I think that Genesis, the historical record, provides us with that. So that's what we really wanted to try to do, is to contribute to that positive case that there was a real events that happened in real history, and there are a lot of things we don't know. I mean, I remember we showed the film at one point, and Todd Wood had just finished watching it, and he was like, wow, you let us kind of ramble on a little bit and even say there's a lot we don't understand. And I think that's an important point about this, is that science is limited in what it knows about the world, and that it is an authority, but it's not an ultimate authority. And that really, Genesis is where we go as our ultimate authority. And I think that's what we all came here to look at and to understand, is that it is, in many cases, it's faith seeking understanding, as a much greater man than me once said. So that was the reason we made the film, was really to give the scientists an opportunity to present this case. The second question is, why do we do a conference like this? Well, for a couple of reasons. The reason y'all are all here is we wanted to connect these scientists and scholars with really the next generation, either of students. I mean, we had a young student come in from Bellingham, Washington, 18 years old, who wants to be a paleontologist. And I know that she said she's took over 47 pages of notes. It may be up more than that by today, probably over 50, right? Yeah. And so she sat and listened to Dr. Wise and Dr. Austin and Dr. Snelling in the geology, paleontology segment. So that was an important part of this, is we wanted people to be able to have a smaller, intimate atmosphere to talk and listen and discuss. And I think that's what we did. But one of the things we also wanted to do was to provide really an opportunity to see some of the depth for those out there. And that's the reason we filmed all these lectures, is that, and streamed many of them, is we wanted people to realize that in the film, 5 minutes, 7 minutes, 10 minutes was the tip of the iceberg. That these men have done an enormous amount of work over those many decades, and we wanted to show that. And so this is an example in a more academic setting. Granted, it's not a feature film. And in some cases, that's what you've got to do, to sit and listen to Dr. Steve Boyd go through all of the Hebrew statistical analysis. It's a deep, complex thing. And to hear Dr. Petrovich really explain different aspects of the Babel, why he thinks the Uruk dispersion expansion, is the right one, as opposed to the one that happened with, I guess it was the Eridu. Is that right?
With Ubaid.
Ubaid, thank you. See, I'm going to get the names wrong myself. It's just there's too much going in this week.
On my session.
Exactly. Well, I was there. It's just it's kind of been displaced. And I think that's the point, is that many of the things that we talked about in our film were so very shallow in terms of the depth. And so we had over 60 lectures here. There's probably over 40 hours, 50 hours of material. And I think even the scientists and scholars would say that they're really only getting started. I know Dr. Wise could have quadruples probably underestimate. He probably could have 10 times what he had done, and I think he spoke more than anyone else this week, and he really just barely got going. So, and that's the case for many of these, is that there is an enormous amount of material that supports the young earth creationist position. These are not non-scientific and non-founded views. These are views that have an enormous amount of work and evidence behind them that are very reasonable. And I think that was one of the things I've seen. There is a tendency to critique these guys. And I gotta be honest, one of the things that ticks me off more than anything, I heard it at the BioLogos. They did a review of this. And this is a great example. Let's take that as an example. BioLogos did a review the day after the film came out, and they said, you know what? The great unconformity is only in Dr. Steve Austin's mind. Then, if you didn't notice, a day afterward, they came back. 3 professional geologists who supposedly should know what they're doing, then came back and said, well, we had to someone pointed out that there actually is something called the great unconformity. And I'm thinking, well, I've read Derek Ager's book. He talks about this in the 1973 volume. Everyone knows this. This goes back to, Leonard Sloss and his work on the megasequences. Everyone knows the great unconformity that is below the Salk megasequence. And yet it seems that there seems to be a desire for people to criticize and say, well, these young earth creationists, they don't know what they're doing. These guys aren't really scientific. That is totally wrong. It's a red herring. And I think it's actually an attempt to divert from the reality that young earth creationism has an enormous amount of very solid, reasonable evidence. And there are very smart men that have done this work. And so I have to say, that is the quickest way to get me angry, is to be able to say things about these men. It's okay to say, I don't agree with you, but then to discount, to say, wow, they're stupid, or oh, they're loons, or whatever, that is called ad hominem. And when I debated, that's a great example of how, I'm going to push against the person because I don't really want to deal with the argument. And I think that we've demonstrated with the 60+ lectures that are here, that there's a lot of argument. And I know any of these men are more than happy to debate the details. And many of them will say there's a lot we don't understand, but there's a lot we do. And I think it's fair to say that the reason we did this conference is we wanted to show you that there is an enormous amount of material there. Now, the third thing, the question is, where do I see creationism headed? And you heard me give that talk with Dell, kind of creationism from 12,800 feet. And, I really see that there's a bright future for young earth creationism. In many cases, when I started this project out, I had a really good talk with John Baumgartner, a man for whom I have an enormous amount of respect, very early on working in creationism. And John's an older man now, and we discussed this, and he said, I wonder if there are younger people going to come into this. I wonder where this is headed. And I know there's always been that concern about this. Where are things headed? But I often think that the Lord sometimes, we used to have a saying in the Navy, it's always darkest before the dawn. Actually, it's kind of true. When you're standing on a bridge, it has this little darkness that happens right before the dawn comes. And someone explained that what atmospheric effect at one point. The point is, I think it's true, and I think that young earth creation, I was talking with Ken Ham when he was we were met with him about this film. And Ken was commenting, he said, I'm realizing there's a lot of people in different silos doing things. He goes, yeah, we're doing our arc, which is wonderful. We're doing our stuff, but there are a lot of other creationists doing some great stuff. And I think it's important for creationists to work together to realize that we are all on the same team, and that and that's one of the reasons why Answers in Genesis was very good. Creation Ministries International, they were very good. Gary Bates, very supportive of the project. And I think that there have been many others in these creation organizations that have been very supportive. And I think that's the idea that we need to work together. So I think there's a bright future. I think there are a lot of younger folks coming into this. I think many of y'all here may decide after this week, I think I can do this. And a lot of the men that you spoke with have said, it's not easy. It's going to be a challenging path. It was very happy to me to see all the faces of the and at my age, I can say this, the boys and the girls that are here. You're a lot younger than I am, many of y'all. But that we see a lot of different backgrounds and a lot of folks coming into this. Now, that said, I have a tendency to look at things that are potentially problems as that's where you want to go. I mean, someone said, make a film with a bunch of scientists, talking heads for 2 hours, no one's going to go see that. Then they got a good reason. I mean, that doesn't make sense. I mean, if I was a betting man, I probably would not bet on the success of a film with a bunch of talking heads talking about, creation science. And yet, I think that there is a real desire to know these things. And so what it made me realize is that there are, as I think again to quote Todd Wood, it's amazing how much we have accomplished with so little. Underfunded, most people pushed out of jobs in major universities, very difficult to get them, and yet they are making such strides because, as again Dr. Wood said, the truth is really on our side. There really is a historical event of the flood. There really was diversification. There really was a creation of created kinds, and there really was all the things that the Bible talks about. So in light of that, though, I think that many of y'all, I would like to encourage you with what I have seen as places to go. Meaning if I were young and had the abilities, which I have neither, but if I had the scientific abilities and was young, these are things I would be interested in looking at. One of them is what we talked about with Dr. Snelling, and that's radioisotopes. Why do radioisotopes do what they did during the time of the flood? Why do they show up, these changes? Why are there, does it appear that there was some form of speeding up in the past or some acceleration? There's a lot of curiosities there. I mean, to me, this is Nobel Prize worthy stuff. If someone is able to demonstrate that there are things, whether it's the binding forces of atoms or something else causing it, why is that? And how does that potentially affect things like diversification? Is there a relationship there? Is there a relationship to things that we talked about, and I'm completely speculative here, this curiosity of the soft tissue in dinosaurs. I remember talking to Mark Armitage, actually, we went and discussed this whole time of his discovery of this, saying look, I broke the horn open and it was not even decalcified. There were fibular sheets inside the Triceratops horn. He goes, this is strange. And now you go look in Nature magazine saying it's actually common to find this soft tissue. Well, why did this even get preserved? I mean, again, as I think Kevin Anderson said, it's strange to imagine this happening for even 5,000 to 6,000 years. How is it even possible? So I think there are many questions of what happened during the flood that we just don't understand. And I think that that's a really interesting area to look at. I want someone to look at linking up Genesis 9 to Genesis 12. This is the time of the tertiary. It's after the flood. And I asked Andrew, I said, I want to do my next film. I want to do it after the flood. And he said, well, you can't. He said, we don't know enough yet. He said, we got to do a lot more work. And so I think that this is the time is to say, so what happened with the animals? What happened in terms of archaeology? These are multidisciplinary. I've talked to Dr. Wise. I've talked to Dr. Petrovich, Dr. Wood. There's many people. This is going to require geologists and paleontologists and archaeologists working together to say what happened after the flood. Where is the flood, post-flood boundary? And how does that work itself out? Meaning, it makes a lot of sense to say it's the KPG, the Cretaceous and the Paleogene. Makes the most sense paleontologically, but you got to pull a lot of things together. And there's a lot of disagreement even in creation today about that. I think that's not a bad thing to recognize that there's disagreement. And again, in discussing this with John Baumgartner, we were both like, these are things that need to be out and discussed. That creationism has come of age to basically be honest and say, well, we disagree with this. Either you're right or I'm right or we're both wrong. But we can kind of recognize that we're not going to agree about everything, and that's okay because we do agree on the history that happened in the text. And science is normal. Scientists have a tendency to disagree. In fact, I hear a lot of stories about scientists disagreeing over very small things, and every scientist knows this is not Christians, this is scientists. So, that said, as a point to Dr. Boyd, chronology, the chronology of the flood. What about the chronology of the Bible? Is it Masoretic? Is it Septuagint? These are controversial things, but I think controversy is good for us. I think that's what we need to be asking ourselves these questions is that, so what really do we know? A lot of people work off certain chronologies of the Usher chronology, but is it actually right? Is it the most accurate chronology? Are there others? And I've got two people say, no, it's not right. My biblical and archaeologists are both pushing against that. And here's the thing. I think it's important for us to be able to realize that there is a lot we don't know, and there's a lot of work in this area that needs to be done. These are exciting opportunities for young, if I were a young Hebraist or an archaeologist or whatever, the many other folks that work into the world of chronology. So A few other areas, biostratigraphy. I remember that this is always the question I've heard both from a number of the folks we work with, is explaining all of the biomes. How do they fall together? Where do they come from? Dr. Wise, one of the best lectures that I've heard on this is his discussion on the paleontology of the flood, and he had many interesting ideas there. But I think that there's a lot that can be done, and a lot more work in this area about how did all these biomes, why do the ammonites work like they do? Why do they fall like they do? How does this work out? And I think these are very interesting. Again, a lot of things we don't know. I'd like to, as a tip of my hat to Dr. Wood, what are the mechanisms for diversification and how did things happen after the flood? This diversification of animals that we see happen very rapidly, but having listened to Dr. Wood and Dr. Wise on this, we're talking really rapidly. I mean, this is an embracing of a view of change that would be much faster than any evolutionist would ever think, and that's exciting. That basically, in many ways, I think creationists have a better model for explaining what we see around us. If you look at Darwin, he based origin of the species in many cases off in this case, breeding. The idea that you could actually make different things. That was one of the first things he built off of. This idea that we can, through husbandry and so forth, change animals and change the way they look, or as even with plants. I mean, this is the number of orchids. I think Dr. Wood or Wise talks about the number of the tens of thousands, 80,000, is that right? Types of, yeah, there's just an amazing amount of orchids that we have the ability to do. I think that the potential to understand this plasticity of the genetic code is something creationists actually are the ones who are at the forefront to be able to explain that it's been built in from the beginning by the Creator. And epigenetics, all these areas I think are really falling into the creationist world to say, well, actually that was designed, and it was designed by a Creator to do these things. So I feel like where we're headed is a multidisciplinary creationism that pulls together many different people from different areas. And I feel that one of the benefits for being small is that it's easier to work together. And I think that, I remember I really appreciated Dr. Wood's comment that he said, I may have said things to people I shouldn't have yesterday, and I apologize for it. I think that there's a place for that in creation. I was very moved by that and was very impressed. I had a lot of I think that there have been things in creationism all around the board that we have noticed and we know about. And this is every field. Trust me, I'm in the world of film. People do not like each other in some areas. They get frustrated on a set. They get yelled at each other. This is being sinners this side of heaven. And I think that when we realize that creationism in many cases has incredibly brilliant people, it's understandable people get frustrated with each other. I think is always that place of how do we learn to work together moving forward? Because as Benjamin Franklin said, I think we all should hang together or we'll all hang separately. So in this case, I feel like that's what we have seen, and Del and I often talked about the really gifted people that are in this field. The Lord has blessed. And we interviewed some of them. There are many more we didn't interview for a variety of reasons. Either they weren't the right fit. They had some special silo of a topic that we just didn't need to talk about, although we wished we did. Maybe the people we'll be able to interview later on. I remember I wanted to go to Iceland to interview somebody, and we just couldn't pay to go to Iceland. But Iceland has this really fascinating place I read about in Dr. Brand's book, Surtsey. An island that appeared literally in the 60s. And as one of the geologists watching it said, it looked like we were watching millions of years of geology happen in weeks. You can go look this up. We were going to film in Surtsey. This didn't work out for us. We kind of decided that the budget was just not there, much to the disappointment of many of us in our crew. But that's an example, I think, around the world. And I was talking to an Icelandic geologist who is a 6-day creationist who said, I want to show you the volcanoes. He goes, there is so much evidence in Iceland that this is a young Earth. And so I think that we often have just barely begun to scratch the surface. And so creationism has a bright future. And in some cases, we just are happy to be a part of it. I mean, what's coming up? We've ended up we're going to have let's see, I've got a few things. Obviously, if you haven't seen our film, love to see the film. Watch this conference. We're making this conference available for very inexpensive. You can download all the lectures and watch them. So the PDFs will be there. And this is hours and hours of study. In many of these cases, you may want to watch or listen to them a few times. We're going to be putting Bible study together. We're going to have extended material. So all those interviews in the film, well, that was just a little bit. So for instance, let's just take Dr. Austin, for example. You saw him in 2 locations for about 10 minutes. We actually filmed him in 5. And that didn't even include the Mount St. Helens stuff. So we're going to be taking these and making these 20-minute segments so you can dig in to listen to these guys. And that will be all of them. We're going to have 3 separate sets where there'll be the fossils and the rocks, there'll be life and design, and the Bible and the stars. We'll have a book that'll come out. We'll have more materials. And I think that's our hope, is to kind of push people to look and say, you know what, young earth creationism makes a lot of sense. And it makes a lot of sense when you look at the world around you. So I would say it's been a privilege to just be a part, to really, in a sense, be a fly on the wall here, because we got to film everybody and hear and see the interactions with this conference. We appreciate you coming out. Many of you traveled a long distance, but I just think it's been a good opportunity to listen and see and learn some of the amazing things that God has done in the world. And with that, I will end with quoting Nehemiah. One knows about Nehemiah and thinks about Nehemiah, but he has a very useful comment or verse that he makes to us. And he says, "You are the Lord, you alone. You have made the heavens, the heaven of heavens with all their host, the earth and all that is in it, the seas and all that is in them. And you preserve all of them. And the host of heaven worships you." So with that thought, we will finish our conference. And may the Lord's blessings be on you as you go your way. And may many of you in your day overturn the world in terms of what you can contribute to an understanding of creation and the flood and the time that is recorded in Genesis. Thank you.